Chapter 15. Saturday, June 22nd, 1776. As for young children liable to be attacked with the distemper, you must begin with giving them wholesome food. Apply to their heads a small plaster of treacle, which must be renewed every 8 days. Let them always have some pleasant and agreeable smells. Let their common drink be aromatized and sweetened with a little cinnamon, anise, and coriander and sugar. Noel Chalmers and Richard Bradley, Family Dictionary, containing the most experienced methods of improving estates and of preserving health. "It's the devil!" Madame screamed as I opened the door to the kitchen. Ruth had fallen at her feet and lay there, her body shaking violently. Peas were scattered across the floor. What I feared the most had happened. Madame stretched the broom from Becky's hands and raised it over her head. "She has the devil in her!" "No, madame, it's an illness," I cried. "An ailment, nothing more." Madame brought the broom down on the small, twisted body. Ruth couldn't raise her hands to protect herself. The seizure held her fast, her arms and legs stiff and trembling, her eyes wide, but not seeing. "Out, devil!" Madame shouted as she began raising the broom over her head. "No!" I threw myself on top of my sister. The broom came down on my back once, twice, but it didn't matter. I had to keep her safe until the storm passed. The broom handle cracked and Madame tossed it aside. I heard Becky yell something, then Lockton's loud voice boomed, "Enough!" The room quieted, except for the soft bumping of Ruth's limbs on the floor. I looked up. Madame held a chair, prepared to throw it at us. Her husband pulled it out of her hands. Ruth's body suddenly went limp. "What is the meaning of this?" Lockton asked. "She's possessed," Madame sputtered. "I will not have a demon child in my house, Elihu." I ran my hand over Ruth's face and spoke to her softly. Her eyelids fluttered and her mouth moved. "Come back to me, baby girl, come back, Ruth," I whispered. "Wake up now. It's gone, blown away. Come back, Ruth." She looked confused. She always did after a fit. I helped her to sit up. A little blood had soaked through the kerchief on the back of her head where it hit the floor. The wound would need some cobwebs. Lockton sent Becky to the study with the wine. He bade Madame to sit on the chair. She had nearly broke over my head, took a seat himself, and addressed me gravely. "Your sister has the falling sickness," he said. "Does this happen often?" "No, sir." Ruth wiped the tears on my sleeve. "This is not a matter for inquiry," Madame said. "I will not have evil in my house." Becky walked in, poured cider into a chip mug, and handed it to Ruth, who took a large mouthful. Madame took a step backward. "The child's curse will poison us all. I want her sold, Elihu. Sold today." "Sold?" "Wife," started Lockton. "You can't sell her," I burst out. "Hold your tongue, girl," Madame commanded. Ruth drank the last of the cider and stood up. Lockton reached out and set his hand on her shoulder. "They are sisters, Anne. One must remember that." "Please, madam," I said. "She's too little. She'll be hurt." The room fell silent except for the plopping sound of peas falling out to the bottom of a wooden bowl. Ruth was picking up the peas that she'd spilled. The sound reminded me of the pebbles plunking into a deep pond. Becky carried a mug of cider to Madame. "Look there, the little one is already back to her chores, and she did a fine job sweeping earlier." "How often do these fits take hold of her?" Lockton asked me. "Speak truthfully." "Sometimes once a day, sir. Sometimes weeks will go by." "Once a day?" Madame's voice rose again. "Ho, Lockton," the mayor called from the study. The master studied my sister, then tugged his waistcoat over his belly. "The girl is harmless and useful," he said. "She will work in the kitchen with Becky. That is my decision. Do not disturb me again with womanly prattle." The kitchen fell silent as the master walked away. When we heard the door to the study close, Madame pointed at Ruth. "Don't let her near the milk. She'll curdle it. And don't get used to her presence here. Elihu will soon see reason." She stalked off, leaving a sour smell in the air. Ruth crawled under the table to pick up the peas that had rolled there. I watched her and tried to stop my hands from shaking. "What will happen to us?" "No way of telling." Becky pulled an eel from the basket. "It's near impossible to hire help, what with folks running off in fear of the war." She cut off the eel's head. "Long's you two can stay out of trouble." She grabbed the eel skin at the neck and pulled it all the way off. "I imagine you're safe enough." I bent down to help Ruth with the peas. Chapter 16. Sunday, June 23rd, 1776. A report prevails here that a most vile, deep-laid plot that was yesterday discovered at New York. I have not been able to ascertain the particular facts. However, 40 persons are apprehended and secured. Among them is the mayor of the city, What baseness are our enemies not capable of? Who would wish to be connected with a people so destitute of every virtue? God forbid it should ever be the fate of America. Letter of Congressional Delegate William Whipple to Joshua Brackett. Ruth fell asleep quick that night, my arms around her. I had washed out the blood from her kerchief and hung it to dry. There was a lump on her head, but it would go away. Madame's threats would not. I slowly pulled my arms out from under my sister. She sighed and curled into a tiny ball. I had pondered the problem all day and half the night. No matter how many times I turned it round, I found the same answer. We had to flee the city. I sat up and pulled the blanket over Ruth, tucking it under her feet to keep her warm. The wings that could spirit us away were hidden in the master's desk. I had to take the list. It would buy us our freedom. But Bellingham would not listen, not after the incident with the linen chest. I had to deliver it straight to the army. The sound I had been waiting for broke through, the low roar of Master Lockton's snores, starting up just as the grandfather clock chimed midnight. I put on my skirt and made my way to the bottom of the stairs. The hour was upon me. 'Twas time to act. The moon was my friend. It lit up the library enough for me to make my way without stumbling into anything. The snuff jar stood on the corner of the desk. I held my breath as I lifted the lid, put my hand inside, and slowly pulled out the keys. I crouched behind the desk and examined them in the moonlight. Only one was small enough to fit into the top drawer's lock. I inserted the key and turned it gently to the right. There was a dull clunk. The drawer slid open a hair. I forced myself to remain still and count to 20. Lockton's snores continued above, regular as waves crashing against the side of a ship. I pulled open the drawer and peered inside. It was crowded with abandoned quills, a rusty tinder box, and a few coins and pound notes which I was sore tempted to take. I felt through the drawer with careful fingers. What had he done with the list? Was it in his coat pocket? I reached into the back of the drawer and pulled out a black hair ribbon. Had he given it to the gold buttons for safekeeping? There! From the farthest reach of the drawer, I pulled out a single sheet, folded once. I held it up to the light and quickly read. It was a list of names with the mayors at the bottom. He had titled it Committee to Preserve the King's Peace. I tucked the paper in my pocket, tied it tight, and slipped it under the waistband of my skirt where it could not be seen. I closed and relocked the drawer, then carefully returned the keys to their hiding place. I tiptoed back through the house and slipped outside, quiet as a ghost. The air was hot and dripping, as if the city were wrapped in a wool blanket, just pulled from a boiling pot. I made my way along the streets, seen only by cats, rats, and a slave hurrying by with a bundle of her head. Since she carried a lantern and no doubt had a pass from her master, she was allowed to be out walking after dark. I was not. The woman said nothing as she passed by me, but started singing the second verse of Yankee Doodle in a strong voice, which I thought curious indeed. I listened close to the words. Father and I went down to camp along with Captain Gooding, and there we saw the men and boys as thick as pasty pudding. She was sending me a message. I dove behind a log barricade just as 2 soldiers turned the corner, talking intently to each other and sweeping the street with their eyes. I said a quick prayer of thanks to the singing woman for her help. When the echoes of the soldiers' boots had vanished, I moved on, staying away from the lights of the sentry fires, passing under the dark shadow of King George's statue in the Bowling Green, and hurrying to my destination. The battery was the fort at the southern tip of the island, with high walls and cannons that pointed over the water to discourage enemies. It was headquarters of the Patriot Army in New York. Even if General Washington was elsewhere, here I could find an officer who would understand the value of the list. I marched past the rows of tents set up on the grounds outside of the fort, trying very hard to ignore the men and boys who stared as I walked by. I neared the gate. A sentry stepped out and blocked my way. Do you have a pass, girl? I swallowed hard and tried to remember the name of the colonial who worked with Master Bellingham. Fagan, Jaden, McRaden. Well, a few soldiers drinking coffee outside their tents had stopped talking to observe. Please, sir, I said, polite and firm, I've come with an urgent message for Colonial Reagan, sir. Tell me, and I'll see that he gets it. I cannot, I said. I must deliver it to him personally, sir. Who's your master? Telling a lie would not benefit me. A loyalist, sir, who would beat me bloody if he knew I was here. He looked me over and yawned. Come on, then. I could do with a walk to keep me awake. I followed him inside, past a room of men sleeping on the floor, along a hall to a small room where a low fire smoldered in the hearth, a chair drawn up before it. The moonlight had broke free of the clouds again, and lay in grey pools beneath the windows. A table stood by the door where a heavy-set man scratched away on a piece of paper, his work lit by half a dozen candle stubs that would soon burn out. The soldier drew himself up to his full height. This girl had a message, sir. Claims it must be delivered in person. The man lifted a hand in the air and continued with what he was writing. I tried to make out what it was, but his scribble's dreadful bad. Finally, he laid down his quill, moved his spectacles high in his nose, and peered through them at me. "What is it?" he rasped. A voice sounded raw, like it had been run against a grater. An onion poultice was tied around his neck. I dropped in a polite curtsy. "I have information for Colonial Reagan." "Who sent you? Who is your master?" "I cannot say." "Then who will vouch for you?" I vouch for myself, sir. I am new in the city, and know only a boy named Curzon." One caterpillar eyebrow lifted above the glasses as he recognized the name. "Bellingham's Curzon?" He coughed loudly, and sprayed drops of spittle on the page. "He's all bluster." He dipped his quill in the ink pot and continued to write. "Take her away, Sergeant. I am too busy for this." My escort grabbed hold of my arm. "Come now." I tried to break free. "Please hear me out." I shook my arm and twisted it. "They want to kill him." I pulled with all my might and lost my footing. Both the sergeant and me stumbled against the table. The ink bottle overturned and poured across the table and papers. The sick man jumped up with a mighty curse and several ugly statements about my character. "They want to kill the general." I finally pulled free of the sergeant's grasp. "I have proof." The man concerned only with rescuing his papers from the spreading pool of ink. "Sergeant, remove this birdwit." "Do not touch her," the commanding voice came from the center of the room. The sergeant stood at attention. The man with inky hands did too, swallowing hard and wincing at the pain in his throat. A figure rose from the high brack chair that stood in front of the hearth. He wore the dark blue coat of an officer, with buttons and buckles that reflected the firelight. His features stayed in the shadows, but I could see a book in his left hand, his finger marking the page. "Leave us," he ordered. "Yes, sir," the sergeant said. "As you wish, Colonial Reagan, sir," said the man whose clothes were stained blue by the papers he clutched to his chest. When the door was pulled behind them, Colonial Reagan returned to his seat. "Come here," he told me. "Show me what you've brought and tell your story, but keep your voice low. The walls have ears." "Yes, sir." My voice strangulated a bit. The colonial tugged at his coat as he sat down. He was not wearing a wig, as did most gentlemen. His own hair was dark, pulled back into a neat queue, and tied with string. His eyes were sunk deep into his face, with dark hollows underneath them. "Well?" He set the book on his lap, fingers still marking the place he left for reading. I weighted my words before I spoke. "I am in a position to trade with you, sir." "What kind of trade?" "My sister and I were wrongfully taken from Rhode Island. I mean, to get us back there." "You want passage home in exchange for what you know?" "Yes," I said, lifting my chin a little. "Sir?" He nodded gravely. "If your information is as useful as you think it is, I shall personally look into your case best." That was far from a breath on a swift ship, but I had a little choice. "They plan to kill General Washington." He closed the book, sat on the floor, and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Tell me all." I handed him the list and quickly told him everything I knew. He interrupted a few times with questions and had me repeat the mayor's words. Then he bade me to wait by the dying fire as he left the room, and soon reappeared with 4 other men, all clearly dragged from their beds. I was fighting to stay awake myself, but I repeated the story to the larger assembly. A quarrel began instantly, the arguments flying across the room. "How do we know Lockton didn't send her with a false story?" "That's just a list of names. Anyone could have written it." "I know the mayor's handwriting, and these are dyed-in-the-wool loyalists, every one. I don't believe they've turned a lifeguard. Those men are the finest we have. This is nonsense, and I'm going back to bed." Her story confirms what we've heard from other sources. This from Colonial Reagan. He explained that several spies had brought him the same rumor earlier in the day. He walked to the hearth and looked at the glowing embers. "All that remains is to decide what to do with the information. Who has the list?" A man wearing his uniform coat over his nightshirt waved the paper in the air. "Return it to the girl." "Why on earth would we do that?" he asked. "I want her to plant it back where she found it. 'Tis best they believe her plan is still secret. That improves our chances. improves our chances of rounding them up. The man handed the list back to me. I thought for a moment about tossing it on the fire, for it suddenly seemed frightfully dangerous, but I folded it back in my pocket. Do you think you'll be able to return it to his desk? Colonial Reagan asked me. Yes, sir, I said. If you hear anything else, anything at all, you come and find me. Do you understand? Yes, sir, I hesitated. And you'll soon help my sister and me get home? His eyes darted to his companions, then back to me. I shall do what is in my power, he promised. Thank you, sir. She'll need the code to get back into camp, said the man in the nightshirt. The new regulations go out at dawn. Agreed. Colonial Reagan bent down so that his face was level with mine. Do not tell this to another soul, on pain of death. Do you swear? I swear, I whispered. The code is Ad Astra. Repeat it, please. Ad Astra? I had never heard such a word, but then again, I'd never before spoken a code. 2 words. Ad Astra. It's Latin. It means to the stars. Will you be able to remember it? Never forget a thing, sir. Chapter 17. Sunday, June 23rd through Friday, June 28th, 1776. Among all the species and degrees of slavery that have excited the attention of mankind, there is perhaps none more pitiable than that of the ill-suited wife. She is bound by the ties from which nothing but death can release her, and whatever her suffering and her wrongings is, compelled by delicacy and a regard for personal reputation, to submit to them in silence and conceal them from observation. Unsigned Colonial Era Letter. What with my busy night as a true spy, code word and all, and the heat in the upper gallery of Trinity Church, I fell sound asleep during the sermon the next morning. I woke when the people around me stood so startled that I popped up from the pew and near toppled over the railing. The next 2 days were long and hot as I awaited word from Colonial Reagan. Master Lockton did not notice that his list of conspirators was a little hand-worn. He was too busy visiting the mayor at his home in Flatbush and spending hours at his warehouse reviewing his accounts. Madame took her meals upstairs. Only Becky was allowed to serve her because of Madame's fear of the demons and the inhabited Ruth. Becky said Madame sat sighing by the window and shuffling her deck of playing cards over and over. We did not bother keeping Ruth away from the milk, of course. Instead, we kept one ear open for the thud of Madame's feet on the stairs. When she approached the kitchen, one of us would whisk Ruth down to the cellar. Ruth understood none of this. She did not complain about the egg-sized lump on her head or anything else. After we finished our business in the privy each morning, I took her to check our mystery garden. The green shoots were 2 heads tall, but gave no clue about their identity. It was perfect growing weather, especially for flowers and corn and strawberries. It was perfect weather for going home. I practiced the code over and over until it felt like a prayer in my mouth. Ad Astra, Ad Astra, Ad Astra. I was desperate to talk to Colonial Reagan about our release from the city, but dared not leave Ruth alone in the house with Madame Lockton. The thought of Madame putting Ruth up to auction was a constant torment, like bees darting in and out of my sight, daring me to swat at them. The gossip from the market was fantastical. Becky brought back tales of sea monsters chasing the British fleet and a 2-headed calf born outside Philadelphia that portended all manner of disaster. Folks were prickly and fearful. Loyalist shopkeepers had been tarred and feathered by angry mobs and their shops destroyed. Each day dawned hotter than the one before. Ad Astra, Ad Astra, Ad Astra. 2 mornings after my meeting with the Colonial, a visitor pounded at the kitchen door. I was kneeling on the other side of it, polishing the lock with an oily rag and rotten stone. The noise near gave me an apoplexy. When I opened the door, I was shocked not to see a messenger, but the rotund figure of Mr. Goldbuttons. Instead of wearing a hat or coat, he had a long cloak draped over his head, and his wig sat askew. He stormed past me toward the stairs. "Is your master still abed?" he shouted back at me. "Yes, sir." Goldbuttons dropped his cloak on the floor and ran up the stairs as if his breeches were on fire. A moment later, Master Lockton bellowed like a stuck bull, then thudded heavily across the floor and yelled for Becky. The plot to kill Washington had been uncovered. I was sent to fetch Madame home, for she had gone to call on a friend. Goldbuttons had vanished by the time we returned. Madame hurried to the library and told me to fetch her ivory fan from her bedchamber, for she was feeling faint from heat and excitement. As she opened the door, I caught a glimpse of the master pacing frantically, his nightcap still on his head. He looked up and saw us. "Thank heavens, there is much to do and no time. The worst has happened, Anne." I started up the stairs to fetch the fan, moving slow as possible to overhear the words. What is the meaning of this, Elihu? Madam demanded. Listen carefully, Lockton interrupted. The rebels know. I've sent for a cart. We must burn my papers. Dear God, protect us, Madam prayed. How much do they know? Wait 1 moment. I took the steps 2 at a time and was near the top when Madam stepped into the hall and pointed at me. Forget the fan, girl. We need firewood for the library, she said sternly. Now. Lockton and Madam were exchanging heated words across his desk by the time I brought in an armload of wood and a few coals from the kitchen in the copper coal carrier. They seemed not to notice as I walked in. You are abandoning me, Madam asked. You'll be safer here. Lockton dumped a folio of papers on his desk and brooded through the mess. Aunt Seymour isn't leaving, and we have credit with all the merchants. Your aunt despises me, Madam said. You must stay to defend our name and honor. I arranged the wood so that it would not catch quickly, set the hot coals underneath it, leaned forward, and blew gently. I am guilty, Anne. They won't give me a parole this time, but as soon as the rebels are driven out, I shall return. What if they arrest me? Madam asked. Let me go with you. You must stay to keep them from stealing all that we own. Madam picked the blue china snuff jar off the desk and flung it against the wall. It shattered and left a mark on the plaster. I will not, she shouted. I will not be left at the mercy of our enemies while you slink away. Despite my best intentions, the kindling wood caught hold of the spark and burst into flames. Master Lockton crossed the room to pick up the keys that had been hidden in the jar. He placed them in his pocket, then, without warning, hit Madam with all the force in his arm. She flew into the bookcase, causing several books to tumble to the ground. I almost reached for her, but was afraid to anger Lockton any further. I command you stay here, Anne. This is your duty, and you will obey me. He turned to me. The fire is satisfactory. Leave us. Yes, sir. As I closed the door, Madam started in again, begging him to take her with him, or at least to let her know where he was going. A carpenter soon arrived and nailed the master into a large crate marked cheese. As the final boards were being put into place, Lockton told Madam that he would first head north, then to Dr. Van Bersick's house in Bergen County. 3 men loaded the heavy crate into a cart driven by men I had never seen before. Becky tended to Madam's battle wounds with ointment and medicinal wine. I offered to fetch Lady Seymour, but in truth I planned to run the news of Lockton's escape to the rebels as fast as I could. Madam insisted we all stay in the house with the doors and windows locked. She passed the night burning packets of papers in the fire and demanding gallons of tea and fresh biscuits. When the soldiers arrived at dawn to arrest the master, his business papers were all ash, and the crate of cheese was long gone. The angry soldiers tore through the library but found nothing, save for the shards of the snuff jar. These they stomped under their boots before they departed. Becky went to the market and left me to clean the mess. She returned with a freshly killed hen and a basket full of beet greens. Before Becky could remove her bonnet, Madam shuffled into the kitchen. What news? Madam demanded, her eyes red, perched above dark rings from a sleepless night. A livid purple welt had raised on the left side of her face where Lockton had struck her. Most of the bruises on her arms and shoulders were hid under her gown, but she walked stiff and sore as an old crone. Becky gave her the gossip from the market stalls. Conspirators who plotted against the American cause had been arrested all over the city and in several close-by villages. The mayor, 2 doctors, a shoemaker, a tailor, a chandler, a gunsmith, a drummer, and a fifer were all charged with treason and a host of other offenses. How did they uncover the plot? Madam asked. I picked up the beheaded chicken and carried it to the basin. I held it by the feet so that the last of the blood could drain out before I plucked it. Becky hung her hat on its hook and pinned on her apron. One of the conspirators flapped his mouth, and the story poured out. Hickory, his name is, a tall Irishman who served the General Washington's Life Guards. Did anyone mention Master Lockton? Only that he was one of them that got away, ma'am. They caught one fellow trying to cross the East River, couldn't row hard enough against the tide. The master is well out of harm's way, which is more than I can say about myself, Madam muttered gingerly, rubbing the violet bruises on her wrist.